The restitution proceedings had provided substantial financial settlements and property restoration that established Isabella and Serafina as legitimate claimants to constitutional authority and royal inheritance, while creating comprehensive legal framework for constitutional justice and institutional accountability that served both individual rights and broader democratic principles governing constitutional monarchy and parliamentary democracy throughout the international community. The international accountability proceedings had been coordinated through United Nations human rights mechanisms and international constitutional law institutions that had investigated the royal conspiracy as systematic violation of constitutional principles and international law that threatened democratic governance and constitutional monarchy throughout the civilized world, establishing legal precedents and accountability mechanisms that prevented similar institutional conspiracy while providing international recognition and support for legitimate constitutional succession and inheritance restoration. The international investigation had also resulted in comprehensive reform of constitutional succession law and royal inheritance regulations that had been implemented throughout constitutional monarchies to prevent institutional conspiracy and ensure ongoing accountability and transparency that protected constitutional rights while enabling legitimate constitutional monarchy and parliamentary democracy that served public interest rather than institutional protection and criminal immunity that had characterized previous approaches to royal succession and constitutional governance. The comprehensive exposure of the royal conspiracy and institutional criminal coordination has demonstrated that individual courage and systematic investigation can overcome institutional power and governmental secrecy when evidence of constitutional fraud serves broader public interest and democratic accountability, providing hope and practical examples for ongoing efforts to ensure constitutional transparency and institutional integrity that protect individual rights while serving legitimate constitutional monarchy and parliamentary democracy through constitutional processes and democratic oversight, rather than systematic conspiracy and criminal coordination that violates constitutional principles and international law. What do you think about this incredible discovery of royal deception and the courage it took to expose constitutional fraud that threatened democratic governance? Have you ever discovered family secrets that changed everything you thought you knew about your heritage? Share your thoughts in the comments below about constitutional justice and the importance of holding powerful institutions accountable. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of ordinary people who changed the world by standing up for constitutional rights and democratic principles. The primary underground chamber measured approximately 60 feet in length and 40 feet in width, with vaulted ceiling heights that provided comfortable circulation space while maintaining structural integrity through reinforced stone construction and steel support systems that enabled long-term occupancy and material storage within environmental conditions that had been precisely controlled through sophisticated climate management and atmospheric preservation systems that maintained archival quality air purity and contamination prevention protocols that maintained archival quality air purity and contamination prevention protocols maintained archival quality air purity and contamination prevention protocols that maintained archival quality air purity and contamination prevention protocols that maintained archival quality air purity and contamination prevention protocols that maintained archival quality air purity and contamination prevention protocols that maintained archival quality air purity and contamination prevention protocols.
The chamber's environmental controls had included atmospheric filtration systems with multiple redundancy levels, humidity regulation equipment that maintained precise moisture specifications, and contamination prevention measures that indicated previous operational uses involving historical documents and priceless artifacts that required absolute environmental control and preservation protocols that characterized museum-quality repositories and institutional archives rather than normal estate storage or family collection preservation. Additionally, the primary chamber had contained specialized storage systems and display infrastructure that indicated previous installation of archival equipment and preservation technology that required museum-quality environmental isolation and security protection that characterized professional historical repositories and cultural institution archives that maintained collections of extraordinary value and historical significance rather than normal family estate storage and personal collection management. Serafina's systematic documentation of the underground facility had revealed that the primary chamber connected to additional specialized areas through a corridor system that extended beyond the immediate excavation, suggesting that the concealed facility encompassed substantially more space and preservation capability than their initial discovery had indicated, while incorporating design features that enabled segregated storage and controlled access to different materials and collections according to security classifications and preservation requirements. The corridor system had been constructed using the same professional excavation and engineering techniques that characterized the primary chamber, with structural reinforcement and environmental controls that enabled safe passage and materials transport throughout the underground facility while maintaining security features and access controls that could isolate different areas and restrict access according to security requirements and preservation protocols that govern different collections and material storage procedures. Her investigation of the corridor system had revealed access points to 5 additional specialized chambers whose construction and configuration indicated specific preservation purposes, including document storage, artifact display, materials research, and security monitoring that required dedicated space and environmental controls beyond the capabilities provided by the primary chamber, while incorporating security measures that enabled controlled access and operational isolation according to collection management protocols and security requirements. The first specialized chamber had been configured as a document preservation facility with climate controls and storage systems that indicated previous use for historical manuscripts and legal documents that required archival quality storage conditions and security protocols, including temperature regulation capabilities, atmospheric controls, and access monitoring systems that characterized professional archival operations and institutional document preservation rather than normal estate record storage and family document management. The document storage chamber had contained specialized archival equipment, including climate-controlled storage cabinets, document preservation systems, and security monitoring technology that demonstrated previous operational use for materials requiring professional archival management and institutional preservation standards, while incorporating access controls and monitoring capabilities that characterized government archives and cultural institution repositories rather than normal family estate document storage and personal collection management.
The spring of 1853 brought unprecedented challenges to Dr. Mortimer Blackthorne's understanding of human consciousness. What had begun as treatment for simple headaches had evolved into the most comprehensive study of apparent reincarnation memories ever undertaken in the American medical community. As word of Evangeline Ashworth's extraordinary condition spread through scholarly circles, Dr. Blackthorne found himself at the center of a scientific controversy that would test the boundaries of 19th century knowledge about the human mind.
The systematic investigation of Evangeline's memories began in earnest when Dr. Blackthorne received a letter from Professor Nathaniel Whitmore of Harvard's Department of Philosophy and Mental Science. Professor Whitmore had spent 2 decades studying cases of unusual mental phenomena across Europe and had developed methodologies for testing claims of supernatural memory. His letter, dated March 15, 1853, proposed a collaboration that would bring scientific rigor to the examination of Evangeline's case. "My dear Dr. Blackthorne," Professor Whitmore wrote, "your preliminary reports describe phenomena that, if genuine, would revolutionize our understanding of consciousness itself. I propose that we establish formal protocols for testing Ms. Ashworth's claims, using methods that can distinguish between genuine historical knowledge and elaborate fabrication or psychological delusion." Professor Whitmore arrived in Whitehaven on April 2, 1853, accompanied by his research assistant, Mr. Jonathan Prescott, and an impressive collection of historical artifacts, documents, and testing materials. Whitmore was a tall, austere man in his 50s, with steel-gray hair and penetrating blue eyes that reflected decades of scholarly inquiry. His approach to investigating unusual mental phenomena combined rigorous skepticism with genuine openness to evidence that challenged conventional understanding. The testing protocols that Professor Whitmore established were designed to eliminate the possibility of fraud, educated guessing, or unconscious deception. Evangeline would be presented with artifacts, documents, or linguistic samples from various historical periods, without any advance knowledge of what she would encounter. Her responses would be recorded verbatim and later verified against the most authoritative historical sources available to 19th century scholarship. The first formal testing session took place on April 5, 1853, in Dr. Blackthorne's office, with Professor Whitmore, Mr. Prescott, and the local Presbyterian minister, Reverend Samuel Hartwell, serving as witnesses. Evangeline appeared nervous but cooperative, having been informed only that she would be participating in a study of unusual memory phenomena. She had no knowledge of what specific tests she would face or what artifacts she might encounter. Professor Whitmore began with a piece of pottery that he identified only as an ancient ceramic fragment. The shard was actually part of a Minoan vessel dating from approximately 1500 BCE, obtained from a private collector who had acquired it during archaeological excavations in Crete. No detailed information about Minoan civilization had been published in accessible form, and certainly no mill worker in Vermont would have encountered such specialized knowledge. When Evangeline examined the pottery fragment, her transformation was immediate and dramatic. Her posture shifted, becoming more upright and graceful, while her voice took on an accent that none of the observers could identify. When she spoke, it was as Ariadne of the Sacred Labyrinth, a priestess who claimed to have served in the palace at Knossos during the height of Minoan civilization. This vessel held the sacred oil used in the bull dancing ceremonies, Evangeline said, her voice carrying an authority that seemed borrowed from ancient rituals. The potter who shaped it followed the old traditions passed down from the time when the Sea Kings ruled all the islands. The pattern around the rim represents the sacred spiral, the path that the dancers followed when they leaped over the sacred bulls in the great courtyard. Professor Whitmore exchanged glances with Dr. Blackthorne. Evangeline's description matched what scholars suspected about Minoan bull-leaping ceremonies, based on fragmentary frescoes and artistic depictions found at archaeological sites. But this knowledge was only available to a handful of specialists, and even they possessed incomplete understanding of Minoan religious practices. As Ariadne, Evangeline continued to provide detailed descriptions of palace life, religious ceremonies, and social customs that demonstrated intimate familiarity with Minoan civilization. She spoke of trade relationships with Egypt and Anatolia, described the sophisticated drainage systems that supplied fresh water to the palace complex, and explained the significance of various religious symbols that appeared in Minoan art. Most remarkably, she began speaking in what she claimed was the ancient Minoan language. The sounds she produced were unlike any known language, yet they followed consistent phonetic patterns that suggested genuine linguistic structure rather than random vocalization. Professor Whitmore, who had studied ancient languages extensively, could not identify the linguistic family, but he noted that the sounds Evangeline produced remained consistent across multiple sessions, suggesting that she was accessing a stable linguistic system rather than inventing sounds spontaneously.
When the session ended and Evangeline returned to her normal consciousness, she retained no memory of what had transpired. She seemed exhausted and confused, asking repeatedly whether she had been helpful and expressing concern that she might have said something inappropriate or foolish. The contrast between the confident ancient priestess and the uncertain mill worker was so stark that the observers found it difficult to believe they had witnessed the same person. The second major test involved a collection of medieval manuscripts that Professor Whitmore had borrowed from the library at Yale. The documents included texts in Latin, Old French, and Middle English, as well as several examples of monastic illuminated letters. Once again, Evangeline was given no advance information about what she would examine. When presented with a fragment of a 12th century manuscript from the Abbey of Saint-Denis, Evangeline immediately transformed into Brother Aldrich, a Benedictine monk who claimed to have worked as a scriptorium illuminator during the reign of Louis VII of France. Her posture became more hunched, as if accustomed to long hours bent over manuscripts, and her hands moved with the precise, controlled gestures of someone trained in detailed artistic work. "This is a section from the Chronicle of Saint-Denis," she said, examining the manuscript with the expertise of a trained paleographer. The scribe was Brother Matthias. You can see his characteristic way of forming the letter A and his tendency to crowd the text toward the end of each line. The illumination was begun by Master Guillaume, but finished by one of his apprentices. The gold leaf was applied too hastily, and the binding of the blue pigment suggests they were running short of quality lapis lazuli. Professor Whitmore was stunned. The manuscript was indeed from Saint-Denis, and scholarly analysis had determined that it dated from the mid-12th century. But Evangeline's observations about scribal techniques, illumination methods, and even the specific challenges faced by medieval book producers reflected knowledge that would have required years of specialized training to acquire. As Brother Aldrich, Evangeline demonstrated familiarity with monastic life that extended far beyond what could be gleaned from general historical reading. She described the daily routine of prayers and work that governed abbey life, explained the complex hierarchy within monastic communities, and discussed theological controversies that had divided the medieval church. Her knowledge of Latin was fluent and sophisticated, reflecting understanding of both classical and medieval forms of the language. Perhaps most compelling was her ability to read and interpret the abbreviations and notational systems used in medieval manuscripts. Medieval scribes employed complex systems of shortened words and symbolic notations to save time and materials, systems that modern scholars spent years learning to decipher. Evangeline read these abbreviated texts as easily as if they were written in contemporary English, providing translations that matched the most careful scholarly interpretations. The third major test focused on linguistic abilities using a collection of texts in ancient and medieval languages that Professor Whitmore had assembled specifically for evaluating claims of supernatural knowledge. The collection included samples of ancient Greek, Hebrew, Sanskrit, Old Norse, and several other languages that would have been completely unknown to anyone without extensive classical education.
When presented with a fragment of ancient Greek poetry, Evangeline became Pythagoras of Samos, claiming to be the famous philosopher and mathematician of the 6th century BCE. Her voice deepened and took on a sonorous quality appropriate to someone accustomed to public speaking and philosophical discourse. She read the Greek text fluently, providing both literal translation and commentary on the philosophical concepts expressed in the poetry. "This is from the works of Xenophanes," she said, examining the text with scholarly attention. He was challenging the anthropomorphic conception of the gods, arguing that humans create deities in their own image, rather than recognizing the true nature of the divine. His arguments influenced my own thinking about the mathematical principles that govern cosmic harmony. Professor Whitmore was familiar with Xenophanes and knew that the philosophical connections Evangeline was making reflected sophisticated understanding of ancient Greek intellectual history. But beyond her knowledge of philosophy, her command of ancient Greek was remarkable. She read the text with proper accent and inflection, demonstrated understanding of complex grammatical constructions, and even corrected what appeared to be a scribal error in the manuscript. As Pythagoras, Evangeline displayed detailed knowledge of ancient mathematical and astronomical theories. She explained the geometric principles underlying the famous Pythagorean theorem, described the mathematical relationships that she claimed governed musical harmony, and discussed astronomical observations that would not be verified by modern science until centuries later. When presented with a Sanskrit text, Evangeline transformed into Surya Devi, a temple priestess from what she described as the Gupta period of ancient India. Her posture became more fluid and graceful, and her voice took on melodic qualities that seemed to reflect familiarity with chanted religious texts. She read the Sanskrit fluently, explaining religious concepts and cultural practices with the authority of someone who had lived within that tradition.
The Hebrew text triggered the emergence of Rachel bat Avraham, a scholarly woman from medieval Spain who demonstrated remarkable familiarity with rabbinical literature and Jewish law. Her knowledge extended beyond mere linguistic ability to include understanding of complex theological arguments and cultural practices that reflected deep immersion in medieval Jewish intellectual life. Each linguistic test produced similar results. Evangeline displayed fluent command of languages she could not possibly have studied, demonstrated cultural knowledge appropriate to the historical periods represented by each text, and consistently maintained distinct personality characteristics that corresponded to her claimed identities. By May 1853, Professor Whitmore had documented 12 distinct personalities, each associated with different historical periods and geographical regions. The consistency and depth of knowledge displayed by each personality had convinced him that Evangeline was accessing genuine historical memories rather than exhibiting symptoms of mental illness or perpetrating elaborate fraud. "The evidence defies conventional explanation," Professor Whitmore wrote in his preliminary report to Harvard. "Subject demonstrates linguistic abilities, cultural knowledge, and historical understanding that exceed what could be acquired through education or reading. The personality manifestations show remarkable consistency and psychological coherence. Each identity displays appropriate knowledge for its claimed historical context and maintains distinct characteristics across multiple sessions." But the investigation had also revealed troubling patterns that suggested the phenomenon might be beyond human control or understanding. Evangeline's personality shifts seemed to be intensifying, occurring more frequently and lasting for longer periods. She was beginning to experience brief episodes, even when not participating in formal testing sessions, sometimes shifting into historical identities while at work in the mill or during routine daily activities. Dr. Blackthorne noted that Evangeline appeared to be losing some awareness of her primary identity. She would sometimes refer to events from her historical lives as if they were recent personal experiences, or express confusion about contemporary customs that should have been familiar to her. The boundaries between her various identities seemed to be blurring in ways that raised concerns about her psychological stability. More disturbing still were reports from Evangeline's family and co-workers that she had begun speaking in foreign languages during her sleep, carrying on what appeared to be conversations with people from her various historical lives. Her mother, Catherine Ashworth, reported finding Evangeline sitting up in bed in the middle of the night, conducting detailed discussions in what sounded like ancient Greek or Latin, apparently responding to voices that only she could hear. The mill workers began to notice that Evangeline would sometimes react to routine activities as if they were completely unfamiliar. She would stare at the mechanical looms with apparent confusion, as if seeing such technology for the first time, then gradually remember how to operate the machinery. Her supervisor, Mr. Jeremiah Caldwell, reported that Evangeline's work performance had become unpredictable, varying between periods of exceptional skill and episodes of complete bewilderment. By June 1853, Dr. Blackthorne and Professor Whitmore faced a difficult decision. The scientific value of continuing their investigation was enormous, but Evangeline's psychological condition appeared to be deteriorating. The personality manifestations that had initially occurred only in response to specific triggers were now happening spontaneously, and each identity seemed to be asserting stronger control over her consciousness. The question was whether continued study would help unlock the mystery of Evangeline's memories or potentially damage her ability to maintain a coherent sense of self. The implications extended beyond her individual welfare to fundamental questions about the nature of human consciousness and the possibility that some individuals might serve as bridges between past and present. If this story is captivating you, make sure to hit that like button and share it with friends who love mysterious historical cases. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories that challenge our understanding of human consciousness, and let us know in the comments which of Evangeline's past lives intrigues you most. As summer approached, Dr. Blackthorne began preparing for what he suspected would be the most crucial phase of their investigation. Evangeline had mentioned during several of her personality manifestations that certain locations and objects held special significance for her various historical identities. Professor Whitmore proposed conducting field research, taking Evangeline to museums, archaeological sites, and historical locations to observe her reactions in environments that might trigger even more detailed memories. The proposal was ambitious and potentially dangerous. If Evangeline's condition continued to intensify, exposing her to more powerful triggers might result in complete psychological fragmentation, but it might also provide the definitive evidence needed to prove that human consciousness operated according to principles that 19th-century science could not yet understand. The investigation was about to enter its most challenging and revelatory phase, with implications that would extend far beyond the borders of rural Vermont to touch the very foundations of human understanding about life, death, and the nature of the soul itself.
The summer of 1853 brought both the climax and the tragic conclusion to the extraordinary case of Evangeline Ashworth. What had begun as a scientific investigation into unusual memory phenomena would end in circumstances that challenged everything Dr. Blackthorne and Professor Whitmore believed about the boundaries between life and death, consciousness and reality. The field research expedition that Professor Whitmore had proposed took place in July 1853, when arrangements were finally made to transport Evangeline to several historical sites throughout New England. The goal was to observe her reactions in environments that might correspond to locations mentioned during her various personality manifestations. Dr. Blackthorne had expressed reservations about exposing Evangeline to potentially overwhelming stimuli, but the scientific potential of the experiment ultimately convinced him to proceed. The first destination was the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, which housed one of the nation's most extensive collections of maritime artifacts and objects from global trade expeditions. Professor Whitmore had corresponded with the museum's curator, Dr. Elias Thornbridge, who had agreed to provide private access to collections not normally displayed to the public. Evangeline's reaction upon entering the museum was immediate and profound. Before she had examined any specific artifacts, she began experiencing rapid shifts between multiple personalities, as if the concentrated presence of so many historical objects was triggering simultaneous activation of different memory sets. Dr. Blackthorne observed with growing alarm as Evangeline moved through the galleries, her demeanor and speech patterns changing every few minutes as different identities asserted control. In the maritime section, she became Captain Bjorn Eriksson, speaking in what appeared to be Old Norse and demonstrating detailed knowledge of Viking navigation techniques. When shown a collection of Chinese porcelain, she transformed into Li Mei Hua, a merchant's daughter from the Song dynasty, who discussed trade routes and ceramic glazing methods with expertise that impressed even Dr. Thornbridge. But the most dramatic transformation occurred when Evangeline encountered a collection of Egyptian artifacts recently acquired from European archaeological expeditions. Upon seeing a painted sarcophagus fragment, she collapsed to her knees and began speaking in what Professor Whitmore later determined was ancient Egyptian, her voice taking on the formal cadences of religious ritual. "I am Ankh Efen Sigmet, servant of the lion goddess, keeper of the sacred scrolls in the great temple at Memphis," she declared, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to resonate from the depths of history itself. "I have walked in the presence of Pharaoh Amenhotep, builder of monuments, beloved of Ra. The sacred texts speak of the journey through the underworld, the weighing of hearts against the feather of Ma'at." What followed was a detailed recitation of Egyptian funerary practices and religious beliefs that demonstrated knowledge far beyond what any 19th century scholar possessed. She described specific rituals, quoted from religious texts that had not yet been translated, and provided information about temple hierarchies that would not be verified by archaeologists until decades later. Dr. Thornbridge, who had studied Egyptian antiquities extensively, was astounded by the accuracy and depth of Evangeline's knowledge. He is describing practices and beliefs that match perfectly with what we are beginning to understand from hieroglyphic translations, he told Professor Whitmore. But she is providing details that no modern scholar has access to. It is as if she witnessed these ceremonies firsthand. The episode lasted for nearly 2 hours, during which Evangeline remained fully immersed in her ancient Egyptian identity. She examined artifacts with reverent familiarity of someone who had used similar objects in religious service, explained the significance of hieroglyphic symbols with scholarly precision, and described daily life in ancient Memphis with intimate detail that suggested personal experience rather than academic study. When the personality finally released its hold on her consciousness, Evangeline collapsed in exhaustion. Dr. Blackthorne noted that she appeared physically drained, as if the intensity of channeling such ancient memories had depleted her vital energy. More troubling still was her apparent confusion about her current circumstances. For several minutes after returning to normal consciousness, she seemed genuinely bewildered by her surroundings, asking repeatedly where she was and why she was surrounded by strangers. The second major expedition took them to the ruins of Fort Ticonderoga, where French colonial artifacts had been preserved from the period of New France. Professor Whitmore hoped that exposure to objects from North American colonial history might trigger memories for more recent time periods, potentially providing insights into how Evangeline's apparent reincarnation memories related to geographical as well as temporal factors. The results exceeded all expectations and confirmed Professor Whitmore's worst fears about the psychological risks of continued experimentation. When Evangeline encountered a collection of French military equipment from the 7 Years' War, she immediately became Jean-Baptiste Courtemanche, a French colonial officer who had served under Montcalm during the British siege of Quebec in 1759.
Speaking in fluent 18th-century French, Evangeline described the desperate final months of New France with heartbreaking detail. She recounted specific battles, named individual soldiers who had served under her command, and provided tactical assessments of military situations that matched historical records with uncanny precision. But this personality manifestation was different from the others in its emotional intensity and apparent psychological trauma. Jean-Baptiste spoke not just of military events, but of personal experiences during the fall of Quebec. The personality described watching comrades die in battle, struggling with decisions that led to military defeat, and experiencing the profound grief of witnessing the collapse of French colonial ambitions in North America. The emotional weight of these memories seemed to transfer directly to Evangeline's consciousness, causing her to weep uncontrollably as she relived experiences of loss and failure from 2 centuries earlier. Dr. Blackthorne realized that they were observing something unprecedented and dangerous. Evangeline was not simply accessing historical information, but actually experiencing the emotions and psychological trauma associated with past life memories. The boundaries between her various identities were becoming so permeable that she was absorbing the emotional residue of lives that had ended long before her birth. The situation deteriorated rapidly when Jean-Baptiste began describing his own death during the siege of Quebec. Evangeline's body began exhibiting symptoms that corresponded to the historical personality's final moments: difficulty breathing, chest pain, and apparent injury responses that had no physical cause. It became clear that she was not merely remembering death, but reliving it in ways that threatened her current physical well-being. Professor Whitmore and Dr. Blackthorne immediately terminated the session and transported Evangeline back to Whitehaven. But the psychological damage had been done. Over the following weeks, she began experiencing spontaneous episodes in which various historical personalities would emerge without warning, each bringing its own emotional baggage and traumatic memories. The final crisis came in August 1853, when Evangeline experienced what Dr. Blackthorne described as complete personality fragmentation. Rather than cycling between different identities at a time, she began cycling rapidly through multiple personalities, sometimes shifting between different identities within the span of minutes. Each transition was accompanied by apparent physical and emotional trauma as her consciousness struggled to accommodate conflicting memory sets and incompatible psychological frameworks. During these episodes, Evangeline would speak in multiple languages simultaneously, addressing people from different historical periods as if they were present in the room. She would react to perceived threats from ancient battles, perform religious rituals from various cultures, and express grief for losses that had occurred across 2 millennia of human history. The accumulated emotional weight of 16 different lives seemed to be crushing her ability to maintain a coherent sense of self. Dr. Blackthorne's journal entries from this period reflect his growing desperation and guilt over the role that scientific investigation had played in Evangeline's deterioration. He wrote, "We have pushed too far into territory that human understanding is not equipped to navigate. In our eagerness to document this extraordinary phenomenon, we may have caused irreparable damage to the very person we sought to help. The medical community of 1853 had no treatments for the type of psychological fragmentation that Evangeline was experiencing. Dr. Blackthorne tried various approaches, including sedation, isolation from potential triggers, and attempts to anchor her consciousness in her primary identity through familiar objects and relationships. Nothing proved effective in preventing the spontaneous emergence of historical personalities or reducing the emotional trauma associated with each manifestation. Professor Whitmore, despite his scientific interest in the case, became increasingly concerned about Evangeline's welfare and the ethical implications of their research. In a letter to his Harvard colleagues, he wrote, "We stand at the threshold of discoveries that could revolutionize human understanding of consciousness and mortality. But we must ask ourselves whether the pursuit of such knowledge justifies the suffering we have inadvertently caused to a young woman whose only crime was possessing extraordinary gifts." The end came suddenly and tragically. On September 15, 1853, Evangeline experienced what witnesses described as the simultaneous manifestation of all 16 historical personalities. Rather than cycling between different identities, her consciousness seemed to fracture into multiple fragments, each representing a different past life, all attempting to assert control simultaneously. Mrs. Catherine Ashworth found her daughter in their cottage, apparently engaged in conversations with invisible companions from various historical periods. Evangeline was speaking in multiple languages, responding to different voices, and exhibiting the physical mannerisms of numerous different personalities. But rather than the controlled transformations that had characterized earlier episodes, this manifestation seemed chaotic and desperate, as if her consciousness was being torn apart by conflicting psychological forces. Dr. Blackthorne arrived within hours, but there was little he could do except observe the final stages of what appeared to be complete psychological dissolution. Evangeline's body remained alive, but her consciousness seemed to have scattered across the centuries, leaving behind only fragments of different historical identities with no unifying sense of self.
She died 3 days later, apparently from exhaustion and the psychological strain of attempting to maintain 16 different sets of memories and personality characteristics. Her final words, spoken in ancient Greek, were recorded by Professor Whitmore. "The paths between worlds should not be walked by the living. Some doors are meant to remain closed." The aftermath of Evangeline's death raised profound questions about the nature of consciousness, the ethics of scientific investigation, and the potential dangers of phenomena that transcended conventional understanding. Dr. Blackthorne and Professor Whitmore collaborated on a comprehensive report that documented their findings while acknowledging the tragic outcome of their research. Their report, published privately and circulated only among selected academic colleagues, concluded that Evangeline had demonstrated genuine access to memories from previous lives, but that the human mind was not equipped to handle multiple simultaneous identity frameworks. The psychological mechanisms that normally maintained coherent selfhood could be overwhelmed by excessive exposure to past life memories, leading to fragmentation and ultimately death. The case established protocols for investigating similar phenomena that emphasized psychological protection over scientific curiosity. Future researchers would be required to prioritize subject welfare and limit exposure to potentially overwhelming stimuli. But the fundamental questions raised by Evangeline's abilities remained unanswered, and her death ensured that many mysteries would never be fully resolved. The mill community of Whitehaven struggled to understand what had happened to one of their own. Official records listed Evangeline's cause of death as brain fever, a diagnosis that provided little explanation but satisfied public curiosity. Only a few individuals know the true nature of her condition and the extraordinary abilities that had ultimately cost her life. Dr. Blackthorne continued practicing medicine in Whitehaven for another 2 decades, but he never again encountered a case similar to Evangeline's. He spent his remaining years studying consciousness and memory, hoping to understand the mechanisms that allowed a young mill worker to access memories spanning 2 millennia of human history. His journals, donated to the Vermont Historical Society after his death in 1875, remain the most comprehensive documentation of apparent reincarnation memories ever assembled by the American medical community. Professor Whitmore returned to Harvard, where he established one of the first academic programs dedicated to studying unusual mental phenomena. His research, inspired by the Evangeline Ashworth case, laid groundwork for what would eventually become the field of parapsychology. He never forgot the lesson that scientific pursuit, however noble its intentions, must be balanced against human welfare and ethical responsibility. The cottage where Evangeline lived and died was eventually abandoned by her parents, who found the memories too painful to bear. Local legend claimed that the building was haunted by voices speaking in foreign languages, and several residents reported hearing conversations in ancient tongues during quiet evenings. The property remained vacant for decades before being demolished in the 1890s. Evangeline's grave in the Whitehaven Cemetery bears a simple inscription, "Beloved Daughter, 1829–1853." But those who knew the truth about her extraordinary abilities added their own private memorial. Professor Whitmore arranged for a small bronze plaque to be placed near her headstone, bearing an inscription in ancient Greek, "She who remembered many lives, may she find peace in one." The mystery of Evangeline Ashworth reminds us that human consciousness may operate according to principles we do not yet understand, and that some phenomena challenge the very foundations of what we believe about life, death, and the nature of personal identity. Her tragic story serves as both inspiration and warning about the pursuit of knowledge that touches the deepest mysteries of human existence. The truth about consciousness and memory may be stranger than we dare to imagine, and history continues to reveal mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about the nature of human existence. What do you think about Evangeline's extraordinary case? Do you believe that consciousness can transcend individual lifetimes? Or was this an elaborate psychological phenomenon that science has yet to explain? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories that explore the boundaries of human understanding. The truth about consciousness and memory may be stranger than we dare to imagine, and history continues to reveal mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about the nature of human existence.